Thanks for joining us today. My name is Virginia Palacios. I'm the executive director of Commission Shift based in Laredo, Texas. We're a statewide organization, and we're doing this video series about orphaned wells in Texas. Megan, would you please introduce yourself?
Yes. Hi, I am Megan Millicken Biven with True Transition. And yes, we are here to talk about orphaned wells and a report we wrote about how to deal with the massive inventory of oil and gas wells in the state of Texas.
So Megan and I published a report in January 2022 called Eliminating Orphaned Wells and Sites in Texas. And this is a toolkit of 10 recommendations for the Railroad Commission of Texas and the Texas legislature to deal with this problem of growing orphaned wells in Texas. So we're going to kind of get into all the details, how this works, and some of the solutions over this video series that we're producing. So let's see. I guess the first thing to talk about is what the Railroad Commission is, and it is misleading to call it the Railroad Commission. This is a state agency that actually oversees oil and gas development in Texas. It has nothing to do with railroads. And so, Megan, could you give us a little bit of the history of the commission and what this whole orphaned well problem really is?
Well, sure. We'd have to go back about 100 years ago when oil and gas really began in earnest in Texas. And it was a gold rush, and you had a mix of small independent producers, wildcatters, very similar to what you have in the Permian, and your larger, more well-capitalized firms. And they were in danger of overproducing and killing the oil and gas industry, driving down the price. And so the government, the legislature, everyone decided there needed to be some kind of intervening force. And they decided that the Railroad Commission, the organization responsible for regulating railroads, was going to be the actor that did it. And so they're kind of the precursor for OPEC. They set up proration schedules, and they regulated producers and told them you can only produce this much. And yeah, so that's where we begin. And over that time period, since that time, they've done a lot of drilling. They've poked a lot of holes in the state of Texas. So Virginia, how many wells are in Texas?
I'm so glad you asked. Okay, so we have 800,000 legacy wells that were drilled since the beginning of oil and gas development in Texas, which really didn't take off until the 1920s, right? And then we have about 400,000 modern plugged and abandoned wells. And so when we say plugged, we mean that these wells were filled with some type of a material, probably not cement, sometimes not cement, and they were left for being good in perpetuity, we hope.
Tree trunks, creosote-soaked phone poles.
Yeah, and so after that, we have marginally producing wells, and so these are wells that are just sort of pumping away, barely producing maybe between 5 and 1 barrel per day. And I think we have around 150,000, 175,000 marginally producing wells in Texas. After that, we have inactive wells. So these are wells that aren't producing any product. And right now there's about 150,000 inactive, unplugged, or shut-in wells in Texas. And the only difference between inactive and shut-in is that an inactive well has been inactive for 12 months or more. And the vast majority of that 150,000 is inactive for 12 months. Then we have active producing wells. So there's about 65,000 active producing wells that are non-marginal in Texas. There's another 45,000 service and injection wells. And then we get to the orphaned wells, which is one of the big topics today. There's not as many. There's about 8,000, but they are creating a lot of problems throughout Texas, right?
So everything really is bigger in Texas, is what you're telling me.
Yeah, millions of oil and gas wells drilled since the 1920s in Texas, yes. Okay, so Megan, can you tell us what the difference is between an inactive unplugged well and an orphaned well, and whether one is worse than the other?
It's a great question. So an orphaned well is where there is no financially solvent operator on record. There is no one to pay for the decommissioning, plugging, and abandonment of that well. And an inactive idled well has an owner. It's just they've been allowed by the Railroad Commission of Texas to idle and not plug for whatever reason. There's a variety of reasons. It's plugging extension because there might be a future beneficial use. It's just that if they pay a small fee, they can indefinitely not plug their well. But essentially, they are just an unplugged well, and they represent the same hazards as an orphaned well would.
You said this term financial solvency. Can you explain what that means?
Sure. It means, can the company pay to clean up its mess? Do they have enough capital on hand to pay for that?
Okay, thanks. So basically we have an orphaned well is one where the operator went bankrupt. Mm-hmm. There's nobody around to pay to plug it, right?
Allegedly.
Okay, I like
the mystery.
That. We'll get more into this in a different episode. I met with a landowner in 2020 who had a geyser-like blowout from one of these orphaned wells on her property in 2019. And this was a really tragic situation because her dad had been calling the Railroad Commission over and over again, year after year, trying to get the Railroad Commission to come out and plug orphaned wells, because that is their job. After a company goes bankrupt, the state agency has a fund and they're supposed to come in and pay to plug these orphaned wells. And so he had been after the Railroad Commission to come do that. They never came. He passed away, and his daughter, Molly Rook, inherited this problem of having to deal with the orphaned wells. And she was after the Railroad Commission over and over again, and they never came out. And then there was this geyser blowout on their ranch.
An intergenerational battle.
Yeah.
So may I ask, so I'm going to pause for the viewers and ask you a question, because I think a lot of people may not understand this. So who owns the oil wells? Because she has her property, and then there's an oil well on her property that blew out. Who owns the wells?
Well, like I said, it was an orphaned well, and so the company went bankrupt, was not around anymore. And so, I guess technically you could say that, like, the well is her property, but the responsibility to go and plug it lied with the state. And so I guess the other thing that I want to add about this particular incident is that, the consequence of that geyser blowout was not just the danger of having very high pressure water spraying into the air, but that in that water is high levels of salts, radionuclides, sometimes hydrogen sulfide, and all of that sprayed over a wetland on her property and killed all of the vegetation. And so this can be really disastrous for the environment, or for anybody who lives nearby, for anybody who's breathing in volatile organic compounds that might be, in that water. And so it can be really dangerous. There's another case in West Texas that I know you're really familiar with, Megan. Can you tell us about Antina Cattle Company?
Sure. This is a fascinating story. It's a similar story where it's a woman who inherited a family cattle ranch. And on that ranch, the subsurface owner was Chevron. And one day, a previously plugged well blew out and also exploded into a geyser, raining on her cattle ranch all the same things, salt, and destroying all of the pasture land for her cattle. And during that period of time, she had to move all of her cattle to another estate at a significant cost. What makes the Antina Cattle Ranch story especially interesting is that she went through the normal channels to the Railroad Commission, but it was not until she posted on Twitter that things started to move, and that she got the attention from both Chevron and the Railroad Commission.
It's funny that you say that, because the same thing happened to Molly Rook down in Refugio County. And so she also got no attention from the Railroad Commission until she blasted it all over social media. And so we have this system where the squeaky wheel gets the grease, but we don't have a system in place in Texas where the state regulator is responding to people who are making complaints through ordinary channels. And that's a big problem. And so the next story that I want to tell is about these odd P13 wells. And so these are wells that were drilled as oil and gas wells, and then were allowed to be converted or reclassified as water wells. And so there are a couple of cases in Pecos County, Texas, out in the Permian Basin, where wells like this are causing major problems. And so one of them is on land owned by Schuyler White. There's a massive sinkhole that is formed. My guess is that it's the distance in diameter of about 3 football fields, and it's right on Farm to Market Road 1053. And so we have seen TxDOT has a plan to reroute FM 1063 to the tune of $27 million. It would probably cost much less to just deal with the subsurface problems and plug the well, but they're afraid that they can't deal with it. So
pause. They're actually rerouting an interstate.
It's not an interstate. It's a farm-to-market road, which is a much smaller road, but it is a road that TxDOT keeps having to go out and repair because the sinkhole is active. I mean, it's like continuously moving. So every time it rains, the ground shifts, the road opens up, and it causes a huge safety hazard. And so part of the problem is that there's also a lot of wastewater injection from oil and gas activities going on in the same area. And so we have this like sinkhole that has formed at the site of this P13 well. And so that's a big problem. Just a mile and a half down the road is Bomer Lake. This is a 60-acre saltwater lake that also is formed from a flowing P13 well that was transferred to a landowner at one point in time to be responsible for plugging it, even though it was drilled by an oil and gas company.
So you mentioned injection wells. So this is what I imagine. I imagine plugged wells, and then they're injecting wastewater from production. And so is that water coming up?
Yeah, and so it's coming up through this like P13 well at Bomer Lake, and so there are injection wells around the same area. They're injecting into the same formation where that P13 well is punctured into, and so you have a massive flow rate that has formed a 60-acre saltwater lake that is growing. And I say saltwater, but
yes.
it contains radionuclides. It contains hydrogen sulfide, and in concentrations that can be fatal if you breathe it in. And so
radionuclides, would you mind defining that?
I mean, it's like a radioactive substance. So like, you can take a Geiger counter out there and measure alpha particles, beta particles, gamma particles. So very dangerous.
You've got, if you want to see the Toxic Avenger or a little mini Chernobyl in the middle of Texas, Bomer Lake is your destination.
Yeah, it's kind of scary. So Megan, can you tell us what the total cost of plugging all of the inactive and orphaned wells in Texas would be?
Yes, using the numbers that the state of Texas supplied to the federal government for a recent orphan well grant program, the low ball estimate is about $10.3 billion to deal with that inventory of wells. And that's, of course, if there's no problems. Like some wells are easy to plug, some wells can be monsters and will cost an order of magnitude more. So again, $10.3 billion.
That's crazy. And so there's about 8,000 orphaned oil and gas wells in Texas right now. There's 150,000 inactive, unplugged oil and gas wells that operators still own and are on the hook for. But out of all those inactive, unplugged wells that operators still own, about 17,000 of those are 20 years old or have been inactive for 20 years or more. And so those are wells that cost a lot more to go in and prepare for plugging and actually plug. And so these are things that we also have to think about is like not every well is going to hit that average cost. Some of these wells cost millions of dollars to plug.
So imagine a 20-year-old well. That steel has been corroding. It's rusted. There's saltwater brine eating away at it. And then you have to directionally drill so that you can pump cement and plug and abandon that well. And so that could be infinitely more than the low $70,000 estimate the state has provided.
Yeah, it's a lot more time, labor, technical expertise. I've spoken to an expert well plugger. He says sometimes these well bores are caving in. They have to go in and fish stuff out. That takes a lot of time, and it doesn't always work the way you want it to. So when they have to go back in to plug these wells and cement them, you're not sure if you're getting the cement in the right places or getting a secure plug at the end of the day. So the longer we wait on all these orphaned wells and inactive wells, the less secure and the less sure we are that we're protecting groundwater resources, that we're preventing another very risky blowout, things like that.
We're increasing the costs. The longer you let a well sit idle, the more expensive it will be to plug.
And so we're going to get into how all of this is paid for in future episodes. We are going to be talking about, we're going to be talking about how to design a better program that doesn't leave orphaned wells behind for the public to deal with. We're going to be talking about how to pay for it, zombie wells like on Antina Ranch that suddenly become active out of nowhere after a long time of being dead. And then we're going to, talk about how operators and for-profit companies can start helping to solve this problem instead of the public. So I think that wraps it up for the mystery of orphaned wells, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Thank you so much.